Welcome back to the Bucks' latest podcast, the podcast where we discuss everything Milwaukee Bucks basketball. I'm your host, Jalen Dixon, and today we got a couple of things to get into, but before we get started, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that post notification bell so you always know we're dropping new videos. Hit that hype button so that we can hit the algorithm. And shout out to the sponsor of today's podcast, Kalshi, your sports stock market where you can make trades on anything from the results of the NBA Finals to where you think Giannis Antetokounmpo will be playing basketball next season. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get right into today's episode. And we're going to start off with a little bit more Giannis Antetokounmpo drama because, of course, if we're talking about the Milwaukee Bucks, there's no way to get around it. And ESPN's Tim Bontemps and Brian Windhorst recently were having a conversation related to their side convo with an Eastern Conference executive who essentially has said that the Milwaukee Bucks are hitting the button. The report through Bleacher Report says ESPN's Tim Bontemps and Brian Windhorst spoke to an executive from an Eastern Conference team who said they feel the Bucks are finally prepared to move on from their longtime face of the franchise. Quote saying, "It just feels like they're done with the circus more than anything. They seem to want a clean break and to move on." Earlier this week, ESPN's Sam Shapiro reported that the Bucks are open for business on trade calls and offers for Antetokounmpo. Milwaukee has filled the interest for the two-time NBA MVP throughout the first half of the season before ultimately deciding to retain him, but it seems like the team has had a change of heart. While Bontemps reported that there's a growing belief around the league that the Bucks trading Antetokounmpo will actually happen, some remain skeptical. NBA insider Zach Lowe recently said on the Zach Lowe show that he's spoken to people around the league who aren't convinced Milwaukee will deal the 31-year-old away this offseason, saying, "I had breakfast with an agent, a very high-powered agent the other day, and he was like, 'I'm still betting no trade.' And I said, 'Really?' And he said, 'Just go through the exercise. Who has enough stuff and would be good enough with Giannis Antetokounmpo to contend right away?' At this stage in his career, Antetokounmpo's main focus is chasing a second NBA championship, so he would undoubtedly prefer to land with a team in title contention. It remains to be seen if he will get his wish, but his summer is shaping up to be a monumental offseason in the NBA." So, you have two conflicting points. One is the belief that the Milwaukee Bucks are done. The other being the Milwaukee Bucks won't pull the trigger, not because they're not done with the circus, but they're because of the lack of real resources out there that Milwaukee maybe believes, would be a fair enough trade package to return for Giannis Antetokounmpo. So, it's an interesting spot to be in, genuinely speaking, and I think a lot more Milwaukee Bucks fans are starting to come around to this as this offseason continues to shape up. I think more people are starting to lean towards the idea of trade Giannis, get the most that you can, especially as far as future draft capital is concerned, and let's go ahead and hit the reset button. I think, and I'll be interested to hear what you guys have to say in the comment section down below as far as this, but I think that a lot more people fall into the camp of done with the circus, right? I think, for example, I use this podcast as a perfect example of that, right? For a podcast that has to talk about the Milwaukee Bucks 5 days a week, we find ourselves talking about Giannis Antetokounmpo at least 4 out of the 5 days, if not all 5, all typically framed around negative headlines, whether it's something in relation to the idea of him not wanting to be here, the idea of different trade packages that would end up having him on a different team, right? There's not too many frameworks storyline-wise right now that are indicating that the Milwaukee Bucks are going to be able to keep Giannis, whether that's Giannis Antetokounmpo finally deciding to jump off the ledge and ask for a trade, something that we never thought he would do, and something that a lot of people still think he is too passive-aggressive to do. The other end of the spectrum is just the idea that the Milwaukee Bucks just find the right trade partner to make the trade, worthy. Now, Zach Lowe mentions that the person he spoke to, when you go through the exercise, like how many people have a good enough return package to send Giannis to a winning team while also being able to get the proper kind of draft capital back and trade capital back to make a trade feel worth it. That's one that I think is going to be the most interesting. I think that's one that over the course of this summer, as we kind of hear more different trade packages and things of that nature, we can weigh them. I mean, we talked about it on the podcast plenty of the idea of what's the difference between an Alperen Şengün centered trade versus a Paulo Banchero centered trade versus Tyler Hero and Khalil Ware, right? Like, as we've gone through these episodes, we've had conversations about different trade packages and where they rank amongst one another. Um, but the question at the end of the day for the Milwaukee Bucks front office is, where do they rank in comparison to how they feel about keeping a 31-year-old disgruntled Giannis, right? Because 31-year-old disgruntled Giannis still could be a 25, 10, and 6 kind of guy, even upset. So do you keep that guy in hopes that he'll change his mind from disgruntled to maybe reinvigorated, or do you trade him ahead of a season that could come with a lot more consequence, even if he is somebody that we know from a talent perspective would still play well, right? That's an interesting spot to be in. That's an interesting spot to be in because at the end of the day, like I said, I think that no I've said this on many podcasts beforehand. I still agree with it now. Is obviously there's no fair trade compensation for Giannis Antetokounmpo. Even at age 31, even with his injury history that's piling up, there's no real fair trade package in return that you feel as the Milwaukee Bucks front office like, okay, we got exactly our money's worth as far as moving Giannis in exchange for name whatever the result package is. But the lose-lose of this is that he becomes an unrestricted free agent after this upcoming season. So the lose-lose of it is a lot of betting on a person's personality and betting on a person's past to shape their future. Giannis has done this before. We've seen him change his mind before. We've also seen the Bucks have a lot more opportunity to help in changing his mind. The Bucks have, the capital to do things to maybe convince Giannis, but do they want to use that capital being unsure that it might not be enough? It puts them in a weird spot where I actually believe that the done with the circus aspect has a lot more merit to it, because the truth of the matter is I also think they're done with moves that are actually viable enough to convince Giannis to change his mind. Somebody else who seems like they may presumably want out of town is Myles Turner. Myles Turner has been on a tell-all tour like something I've never seen before, man. He's been on podcasts. He's been on different shows. And he's kind of like giving it up, man. He's like speaking on a lot of stuff that was going on with the Doc Rivers thing. Recently, he spoke on Doc Rivers from the perspective of, I think they were talking about players getting fined for showing up to meetings late and different stuff like that. And Myles Turner was like, "Nah, that's cap. That's not real at all. That wasn't happening. Giannis was showing up at any other kind of time that he wanted to, and different things of that nature." And I'm just like wondering, like, is Myles Turner doing this as a way to like kind of help ploy his way out of Milwaukee? Because like a lot of the players that he's around, and I don't think he's necessarily slandering anybody particularly. I think it all is a response to a lot of the stuff where Doc Rivers tried to kind of make himself sound like an angel on the way out. It was a lot of Doc Rivers trying to cover up a lot of warts, and I think a lot of this season did. I think there was a lot more behind the scenes for this season than other years, as far as Doc Rivers being somebody who kind of lost the locker room, right? I feel like this was the nail in the coffin season as far as Doc Rivers kind of talking his way out of town to a certain extent with the way that he treated a lot of the people that were around him in that locker room. But Myles Turner, man, I've never heard this much from Myles Turner. The most I had ever heard from Myles Turner prior to this summer was some video I think I watched maybe with GQ or something like that. It was like GQ Sports, of him talking about his Lego collection. That was like the most I'd ever heard from Myles Turner in his career. And this is a guy who's been in the NBA for a really long time, low-key, like a true vet in this league. And he's giving it up. And don't get me wrong, right? If he wants out, And this is part of his way of kind of securing that move, coming off of easily like one of his worst seasons in the league. Okay, cool, I guess. I can understand it to a certain degree. What Myles Turner's trade value looks like on the open market is an interesting play as well, given the fact that he is coming off of such a bad year where he didn't really perform too good across the board, shooting wise, points, rebounds, assists. Obviously, all the counting numbers like took a real dip this past season. But more so, you have to wonder like Myles Turner's archetype of shot blocking floor spacer is one that like is still relatively unique even in today's league. You usually get a shot blocker that can't step out, or you get a floor spacer that's not very great at rim protection. Myles Turner's big foible is more of like he's just not a great rebounder for the center spot. There's a lot of like Jaren Jackson Jr. type of stuff with Myles Turner, which is a good thing because Jaren Jackson Jr. is a guy who won a DPOY once upon a time, not even that long ago. I believe it was 2 seasons ago that he won a Defensive Player of the Year, 2 or 3 seasons ago. So the upside of a play style like Myles Turner, both offensively and defensively, translates into a guy that is like all-star caliber, can be the anchor for a defense, things of that nature. But what does that look like? What does that look like, and what does that look like coming off of the year that he did? I'm interested to hear in the comment section down below. One, like, would you guys trade Myles Turner? Two, what would be a fair trade compensation for him? And three, if you were to trade him, is there a particular kind of player you would want in return for Myles Turner? Do you want, somebody that can replace him in the lineup, but maybe is a little bit younger, maybe not as efficient as a three-point shooter, but maybe better as a rim protector? Would you want somebody who is better of a three-point shooter, but not as good of a rim protector as Myles Turner? I think of, for example, um, this is an interesting one, but like Myles Turner and Kristaps Porzingis of the Golden State Warriors. Myles Turner has been a name that's brought up with the Golden State Warriors in the past. Kristaps Porzingis is somebody who is still trying to rehab his stock a little bit. The last time he was in a stock rehabilitation situation, that was with the Washington Wizards. He had two of his best, or I would say really one, but I would say 1.5 of his like best stretches of his career with the Washington Wizards, where he was like a fringe all-star. He could do something very similar in a Milwaukee Bucks uniform in a sign and trade situation with the Golden State Warriors. Warriors get a little bit more upside with Myles Turner, who's I believe a little younger. And even if he's not, I think he has Myles Turner has a little bit more of a like a better stock in the league right now. Than Kristaps Porzingis. Okay, Myles Turner is 30. Kristaps Porzingis. Because this actually does matter in the grand scheme of something like this trade, right? So they're both 30 years old. So that part doesn't really matter as much. It would be all about skill set translation. Myles Turner, I think, is a little bit more of a better commodity at this notion. So if you can get a future draft pick along with Kristaps Porzingis in a sign and trade scenario, you could be the Milwaukee Bucks with having Kristaps Porzingis on a 3-year deal or a 2 or 3-year deal where you can play that rehabilitation role similar to what the Washington Wizards did, and then reflip him while still having that draft pick from the Warriors down the line that probably would be pretty valuable, especially if it's like a 2032 or something of that ilk. Something to think about. Just something to think about. Before we move on to the second half of the podcast, I just want to shout out the sponsor of today's pod one time, and that is Kalshi. Again, Kalshi is your sports stock market, which is the perfect one-stop shop to make trades on anything from the results of playoff series to where you believe Giannis Antetokounmpo is going to be playing next season. Of course, we are in conference finals mode now. The New York Knicks will be taking on the Cleveland Cavaliers, and the San Antonio Spurs will be playing the Oklahoma City Thunder. If we go to the Eastern Conference Series between the New York Knicks and the Cleveland Cavaliers, right now the Knicks have a 70% chance of winning the series according to Kalshi. If we are banking on the Knicks to win the series and you placed $100 down, it'd be a $138 payout if you're right. And the dope thing about Kalshi is as we get more information, you can move in and out of the market. So if the Knicks fall in game one, Cleveland Cavaliers come off of that amazing amazing Game 7 blowout win over the Detroit Pistons and keep that momentum, and Cauchy's board shifts a little bit, you can bump out the market and reestablish. Maybe you believe now that after a 1-0 lead by the Cleveland Cavaliers, you've seen enough to say, you know what, I actually think that Cleveland might win this series. You change your mind and you take a different route, right? And to help you guys out with that, if you download the Cauchy app and you use promo code FANARCH, you can get $10 to trade trade. You can get $10 when you trade $10. So let's say you trade $10 on the New York Knicks to win with this 70% chance. You'll get $10 with this promo code. That'll also give you a $10 to place towards the 30% on the Cleveland Cavaliers. It's a perfect win-win scenario where either way you could get yourself a real payout regardless of the results of the series. And let's say even if you're wrong on the Knicks, you get an even bigger payout if Cleveland pulls off the win, right? So it actually gives you 2 bites at the apple using that promo called FanArc Basketball when you place that first $10 trade. So that's an interesting and unique tactic to use, but it's one that I think could also be a really great way in the very beginning to like jump into this market and follow the series from a completely different standpoint. So with all that being said, shout out to the sponsor Cauchy for again sponsoring this podcast, and let's go ahead and get into the second portion of the episode. Now, of course, as we go through these teams, we know about Giannis Antetokounmpo's preferences and things of that nature or whatever. But another team that is jumping into the fray here as far as the Giannis Antetokounmpo sweepstakes are the Minnesota Timberwolves. Now, of course, the Minnesota Timberwolves, for everybody who's been locked in with Milwaukee Bucks basketball, we all know that the Timberwolves made a real run at trying, at least, right, to land Giannis Antetokounmpo at the trade deadline. His name and Kawhi Leonard's names were probably 2 of the louder names at the trade deadline for the Minnesota Timberwolves. And coming off of the way that they fell in round number 2 to San Antonio, the question now is, like, where can the Minnesota Timberwolves get a real number 2 option next to Anthony Edwards? Right? That's the thing. Julius Randle has played the filler spot for that secondary star for the better part of 4 or 5 years now, and he's had great moments, he's had good moments, and he's had horrendous moments. And I believe that this past series, the second round series, was more of the horrendous time frame of Julius Randle, where the Minnesota Timberwolves are going to have to make some serious changes, and they're expecting to get a real secondary guy next to Anthony Edwards. Now, what does that trade package look like? Well, it'll be interesting because I feel as though guys that you're going to have to really consider putting on in trade conversations, right? Of course, Rudy Gobert. Of course, Julius Randle. I believe that Naz Reid is somebody you at least have to see what his trade market looks like, especially with how well he played throughout this playoffs. But he's a guy that's constantly been, a real mainstay for them as that 6th man off the bench. I do believe that a lot of trade packages, especially if you're someone like Milwaukee hearing calls about Giannis Antetokounmpo, like I want to hear Jaden McDaniels' name. If I don't, I'm hanging the phone up. It's very simple. That's a guy that the Minnesota Timberwolves may not want to part with, but if I'm the Milwaukee Bucks, I'm not taking a Minnesota Timberwolves trade that doesn't have Jaden McDaniels somewhere in the middle of it. So I think there's going to be an interesting spot. Minnesota will be a team that calls, of course, the Warriors, the Heat, the Lakers. A lot of these teams are, of course, already starting to make their ploy for being real Giannis teams. The question now will be, what does a trade package like one from Minnesota look like? Again, excuse me. I am a personal belief that if Jaden McDaniels is not at the middle of a Giannis Antetokounmpo trade, it's not a trade worth making. I could see a logic where maybe you try to trade for just straight expiring contracts and put yourself in a position to have like insane cap space going into the summer of 2027, because there's a lot of different free agents that could be interesting in the summer of 2027 to maybe rebuild, to maybe take this team from being a rebuild to a very quick retool, right? If you just go from selling Giannis to like just like a bunch of contracts that are going to fall off by the end of the year, opens up a ton of cap space for the Milwaukee Bucks to then go ahead and maybe start signing some guys. That could be an interesting way to play it. But again, I think if I'm Milwaukee, unless your draft capital is really dope, which Minnesota's really like isn't. I mean, they control their first round capital for the most part, but it's not dope capital if you're thinking about how, the last 3 years the Timberwolves have been Western Conference Finals, and Western Conference second round. So this is a team you add Giannis Antetokounmpo, the likelihood of them having, really good draft pick return is pretty low. So I think that's all for me to say that I believe that the Timberwolves, with their draft capital, with their players on the roster, I don't think that they're going to be a good enough trade destination for Giannis Antetokounmpo if I'm the Milwaukee Bucks. Again, if Jaden McDaniels is at the center of it, I'm a lot more open to listening. A Jaden McDaniels, Terrence Shannon, multiple draft picks trade could be kind of dope. And of course, that a trade like that would still leave the Timberwolves room to like flip Julius Randle for something else. So there is that kind of idea, but I don't think that's going to happen, and that makes it where I believe that a trade with the Timberwolves probably won't happen either. As more information comes out, we'll probably have more conversations about the likelihood of this down the line. But if I'm going based off of right now, coming fresh off the playoffs, who I think is safe, who I think is not for the Timberwolves, I think that they're not going to put together a strong enough package. Last but not least, just going to do a little bit of a draft thing, talking about Kareem Lopez, because I saw somebody in the comment section of last video mention that they thought Kareem Lopez would be an interesting draft prospect, along with guys like Yaxel Lindenborg and Hans Steinbeck and Braden Burries, guys like that, right? And Kareem Lopez is somebody that I think is the definition of a raw prospect across the board. At just under 6'10", all the measurables are positive, right? All the measurables are things you like. Wingspan of 6 foot, 6'11" and a half, what's that? 8 foot reach. Hand size is positive. Shuttle and verticality show that there's real athleticism, real athletic pop there. Statistically, not going to pop out at you as a player overseas in the NBL. The statistics don't necessarily translate over into like a player that's going to like dominate out the gate. 11.9 points, 1.2 steals, 1 block, 1.9 assists, 6.1 rebounds. Wasn't a great shooter, 32%. From the three, 49.4% from the field, 73% from the free throw line is a positive to a certain degree as far as translatability for what could be at least a decent shooter at the next level. A very raw defender as well. I think somebody that still is very dependent on their instincts and physicality and athleticism alone. Not somebody that has a real amount of like defensive savvy right now. So that's going to be one of those things where maybe he gets picked on early on. They're going to try to use things like backdoor cuts and a lot of motion and movement to kind of take advantage of his lack of IQ on that side of the ball. But I think there's a lot to like about it. It feels very like Giannis-y. And I don't mean this. I'm not saying this just because we're talking about the Milwaukee Bucks. But if you think about Giannis coming from Greece, like the prospect of Giannis was a very underdeveloped guy that had a lot of the intangibles, both mentally as far as hard work was concerned and physically as far as athletic pop and different measurables that kind of translate to a guy who, if put in an NBA weight room, right, and put in the NBA system, like we could see him grow into a real strong player. And quite literally, that is how things end up translating. He got into an NBA weight room over the course of the first 3 to 4 years, especially with the help of Jason Kidd in the early going of his development. This is a guy who kind of grew into his body a lot, and with that, his physical style of play translated into being somebody who became one of the better defensive players in the league. He became somebody who then his offense started to translate, where the more he became dangerous in the downhill slashing game and in transition and bringing the ball up the court and things of that nature. He's become more and more dominant as an above the rim player. And I think Kareem Lopez, he has a little bit of that to him, of like the measurables are all there for him to be somebody that I think that in an NBA weight room where he puts on a little bit more size to kind of match that physical frame that he already is kind of like heading towards. He has the, the 38 foot 38-inch vert. He has the, again, the shuttle was 2.88. That's a net positive, especially at his positional size. There's a lot to like about Kareem Lopez. Again, I'm not comparing him to Giannis Antetokounmpo just for the fact that we're talking about the Milwaukee Bucks. I think there's a lot of that same kind of projecty. The height, weight, speed aspect of him is there. Height, weight, speed aspect of him is there. Now, can we get him on an NBA floor? Can we kind of get him the reps? Can we get him to see what NBA spacing looks like? Can we get him to see what NBA spacing can do as far as opening up transition game? Things of that nature. So, if Kareem Lopez does end up being the pick, we'll do a deeper dive on his fit with the Milwaukee Bucks. And I should preface that actually is something that I want to throw out there too is once we actually hit the NBA draft, we're gonna come up with a bunch of names that could be interesting for the number 10 pick between now and the draft in June, but or June I believe it's June or July. But we'll the the deep dive on that player will be done. Whoever is taken at number 10 will do a deep dive on how they fit with the Milwaukee Bucks. I'll probably go into some film, not on camera, but I'll probably go into some film, find a lot of things that I like, find a lot of things that I think will translate to how this team is currently constructed, maybe eliminate Giannis Antetokounmpo, but the rest of the team as currently constructed and things of that nature. Kareem Lopez is somebody that I think could step in, and a lot of the things we saw from Ousmane Dieng this past year, I think that he can maybe be at a similar spot at that small forward, power forward position, maybe even where they both can play next to each other because Ousmane showed a little bit of ability to step out and shoot that three a little bit. There's some things to like. And I think Kareem Lopez actually, if you're talking about hitting the rebuild button and going into full rebuild, he has the kind of upside where his floor may be a lot lower than a Yaxel Lindenborg or a Hans Steinbeck or a Braden Burries, but his ceiling may be significantly higher than anybody within that group. So Kareem Lopez is somebody that I am pretty interested to see where he lands, even if he isn't a Milwaukee Buck next year. But with all that being said, there's been another edition of the Bucks Latest Podcast. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that post notification bell so you always know when we're dropping new videos. Hit that hype button so that we can hit the algorithm. Shout out to Kalshi for sponsoring the pod. Again, use promo code FANARCBASKETBALL to let them know that we sent you. And I'll see you guys next time. Peace.